Our next speaker is Preston Stovall, who's assistant professor of philosophy at Hradec Králové in Czech Republic. I'll say I met Preston in 2016 at the University of Pittsburgh. I instantly liked him and came to admire him and continue to do so years later. It's great to see you.
Oh, thank you.
So Preston's the author of The Single-Minded Animal, and he co-edited Groups, Norms, and Practices, both of which are over here. Preston, take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about the phenomenology of willing, evaluating, and other collective acts. So what I want to do is I want to approach this from formal standpoint, an empirical standpoint, and the phenomenological standpoint. And one of the advantages of coming late in a conference is that you get to address the stuff that's gone on before. And so I'm going to spend more time on the formal stuff than I'd planned, in part because of things that have happened previously. So Sellars has this remark in some reflections on perceptual consciousness: for longer than I care to remember, I've conceived of philosophical analysis and synthesis as akin to phenomenology. So that's kind of a leitmotif of the talk here. Or this remark from Hegel in the self-consciousness chapter, the beginning of self-consciousness in the Phenomenology of Spirit. Self-consciousness in being an object is just as much, that should be I, not T, is just as much I as object. With this, we already have before us the notion of spirit. What still lies ahead for consciousness is the experience of what spirit is. This absolute substance, which is the unity of the different independent self-consciousnesses, which, in their opposition, enjoy perfect freedom and independence. I that is we, and we that is I. So that's the experience of what spirit is, this I that is we, and we that is I. Now, an absolute substance that is the unity. One of the things that I think is of interest in some of the formal stuff that I'm going to present is that it doesn't require there be something like an absolute substance or a supermind that is the we that is I and the I that is we. But from the standpoint of phenomenology, I want to say, yeah, that's right. That's what spirit is. Okay, so this is the third time I've given a version of this talk since the summer. And this is the outline of the talk that I gave in other places. So it's talk with a little sociological background of philosophy and Sellars in particular. Talk about picturing, this view that Sellars has about representation of objects in space and time, presupposing a structural, he thinks isomorphism, but some kind of a structural relationship, a mapping between ultimately states of the central nervous system and objects in the environment. And then I introduced this notion of what I call shared practical picturing that involves picturing but from the motor representational standpoint, and then deontic picturing, which I think of as a kind of shared practical picturing that involves also the reactive attitudes. But we're all friends here, and we know Sellars' views about picturing, and some of you at least know my views about shared practical picturing and deontic picturing. So what I'm going to do is basically focus on part 6, and what I'm going to talk about at the beginning. So there's really two parts to this version of the talk. In part 1, I'm going to look at some background and Sellars scholarship to the view, and then I'm going to talk about the range and depth of well-founded deontic picturing. And this is the background. So Lutz Seiberth put together a conference for Steffi's work on Sellars' practical philosophy in Potsdam, and in the course of thinking about that conference, I was trying to come to terms with an experience I'd had in Glacier National Park the previous summer. So this was 2022, I think, spring of 2022, or maybe fall of 2022. Anyway, it was 2 years ago because I'd had this experience at Glacier Lake, and I wanted to go actually see the glacier, or a glacier, and I didn't do it the following year, but I did it this summer. So Glacier Lake, this is spring run or summer runoff into Glacier Lake, and on the backside of that ridge, there's a glacier. And in the presence of that vista, I had this feeling of a sense of loss that's not unlike the feeling I get when I go back home in the summer and see my father, who was a military officer and an auto mechanic and was just always doing stuff with his hands and physical, like worked out all the time, and has just gotten older and is not able to do that kind of stuff. He had a lung transplant a year and a half, 2 years ago, actually this month, 2 years ago. And it's just, like just watching my father get old. So I'm standing in front of Avalanche Lake, knowing that on the back side there's this glacier, so this is Sperry Glacier. This is what feeds into Avalanche Lake. And this is taken September 15th of 1913 and September 17th of 2008. So basically the same time of year, 80 some years apart. So, you know, when I'm standing in front of Avalanche Lake and I'm watching the runoff, and I know that on the backside there's this glacier that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and I'm just in the presence of that view and trying to process what I'm thinking and feeling, you know? And so this is where I was at the thing in Potsdam a couple of years ago, and then this summer I really wanted to get back up there and just like see a glacier. I didn't see Sperry because it's a like 6-hour hike to get up there, but there are places in Glacier where you can see glaciers, and so just being in the presence of that. So this is my attempt to sort of work through that that experience and to try to kind of process it. So that's where we're going, but it builds on work that I've already done that's not phenomenological. So now I'm sort of trying to get into the phenomenological side of some of this stuff. So I'm gonna, some of you will have seen some of this before. There will be new stuff for everybody, but some of you will have seen some of this before, and the angle I'm taking now is really from the phenomenological side. So even when I'm going to talk about some of the formal details about intentionality and deontic cognition, I'm going to try to approach it with an emphasis on the phenomenology. Okay, so Sellars makes this distinction between picturing and inferential connections, and he thinks that picturing is a condition on the possibility of representing things. Sorry, I suppose I have to stay next to the microphone. I think it's just obvious that we live lives of shared mental experience. We take it for granted. It's so common that we don't notice it. It's like water for fish. I mean, just to the extent that you're understanding what I'm saying, we're engaged in some shared mental states. Everything we do in social interactions presuppose that we have some understanding of the kind of roles that we have in those interactions. When I talk about this stuff, trying to get on the board that there are shared practical picturing, that our motor representation complex involves something similar. So I talk a little bit about neural mirroring and task co-representation. So this is Stephen Butterfield. Much coordination of joint action appears to involve not fully distinguishing others' actions from your own. Take motor simulation, task co-representation, and motor representation of collective goals. In each case, coordination involves motor or task representations of actions, tasks, or goals that relate primarily to another's part in the joint action. This is not a matter of representing another's goals or plans as an observer. It's a matter of preparing actions and representing tasks that she will perform in ways that would also be appropriate if it were you and not her who was about to perform them. So when I do something that involves a kind of activity, there is a part of your motor representation complex that is running that same activity from the standpoint of my perspective. So you will see what I'm doing. This thing doesn't break. You'll see what I'm doing, and you're not just observing what I'm doing. You're actually putting yourself physiologically into my standpoint. So now, I didn't this time present it in the way that I have in the past because I figure there's so many people who've seen me do this, that you know what's coming. What I do when I present this stuff at conferences or with my students, I'll find something that I can hit. And then as soon as I get to this point, I hit it and I go, oh, God, ah. And invariably there are moans from the room, right? Because you feel that. When you see someone stub their toe, you feel that. So again, these are features of our lives as shared collective intentional beings that so permeate our lives that we don't often notice them. And they're mediated by physiological mechanisms, but they also have a phenomenological component. Okay, so Sellars thinks that understanding shared intentionality is an inroad to understanding morality and maybe deontic cognition more generally, maybe instrumental practical reason as well. There are issues with how to understand the relationship between shared intentional mental states and deontic mental states that I'll talk about, having to do with negation. So some of this came up a little bit in Kyle's talk, so I'll go over that in a little more detail than I'd planned because I think it'll be helpful. But I just want to note that the distinction, so Gibbard is supposed to have been guilty of this negation problem. So Mark Schroeder in particular says that Gibbard's planning semantics doesn't have enough, doesn't have the resources to make sense of the distinction between a judgment of what you ought not do and a judgment that it's not the case that you ought to do something. And this is unfortunately just a failure of Schroeder to have read Gibbard carefully, because Gibbard clearly makes a distinction between preferential and indifferent choices. And when that distinction is drawn, there just is no problem. What's interesting, so I noticed this when I was reading this stuff as a graduate student, and wrote an essay, and it was revise and resubmit at Phil Review, revise and resubmit at Phil Studies, revise and resubmit at Mind, got rejected at Phil Review and Phil Studies after the revision. So then I just let it sit at Mind. I was like, this is stupid. I'm just kidding. But I knew it was wrong. And so then when I started this project in Hradec Kraljevo, where Bernard was the coordinator on the Vienna side, I was able to turn back to this. And then I got into the Sellars stuff on practical cognition, and Sellars makes the exact same distinction, uses the same terminology, preference and indifference. Now, Sellars and Gibbard overlapped at Pittsburgh in the late 70s. But Gibbard, early 70s? Well, in the 70s. Before my time. But Gibbard doesn't mention Sellars. I don't know of anywhere where Gibbard talks about Sellars' views of moral cognition in particular. So I'm seeing a shaking of head and a nodding of the head. Same meaning. Okay. Yeah. He doesn't. Yes, you're right. Gotcha. Okay. So, which is sort of strange. I mean, it's really sort of strange. And Sellars, in the two places where he makes this distinction, doesn't go into it in any detail. In fact, at one point he says, well, we've got to distinguish choosing from preference and choosing from indifference, but I'm sketching a big picture, not going into the details, and he just moves on. So I'm going to talk about the details to a certain extent. All right, the other thing I want to have on the table here, and this goes back to the thing at Glacier. So Sellars in Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man makes this distinction between the scientific and the manifest image, and he thinks that the scientific image is the image of ourselves in the world that science gives us, which is an image in which there's no norms. There's no sense in which we're doing anything right or wrong. There's no mental states. And it seems as though science gives us at least the aspiration of a description of everything that's going on, say, in this region of space and time that makes no reference to mental states, intentionality, normativity. Whereas the manifest image is the image of the human person in the world. And he thinks of of Aristotle as the paradigmatic philosopher of the manifest image. But what's interesting is that in Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, he thinks that the manifest image is itself already a development out of what he calls the original image. And the original image is one where persons are everywhere. So think of thunder as being Zeus is doing something, or trees as having spirits. And so maybe if Aristotle's the philosopher of the manifest image, maybe Plato's the philosopher of the original image. So one of the things I want to do is raise this question of what would it be for the original image to be well-founded, and I'll talk about what well-foundedness is. That's the phenomenological stuff. That's where we're going. First, I want to get through some formal and some empirical stuff. Okay, so this is my view. I've presented this view a bunch of times. Some of you will be familiar with it. Some of you won't. I'll do it fairly quickly. I'm happy to talk about any of it. So the idea is we model an intention, whether individual or collective, in terms of the set of plans on which one makes a choice corresponding with the intention or the choice is needed. And then you just get possible world semantics. You just get the idea that one particular mental state might be like a belief that P is determinate with regard to Q, because you model the belief that P is the set of worlds in which P is the case. Some of those worlds will be Q worlds, some of those worlds will be not Q worlds. If you then decide also not Q, you're eliminating then the P world, so you're taking a subset of that initial set. Similarly, if I have a plan to get dinner with the group, but I haven't made a decision as to what meal to eat, that's the set of plans in which I include some plans where I eat fish, some plans where I eat beef, and then as I make the decision, I restrict that choice. Okay, and then so the double brackets indicate the semantic interpretant of the claim inside them, and then the angle brackets is just set theoretic notation. The subscript of I is a hyperplan that's intentional, and a hyperplan is a maximally determinate plan of action where you take for every agent what they choose to do and what they choose not to do at every point of choice. And then the plan, the thought, I or we shall A and C, is the set of intentional hyperplans where I or we choose to A and C on that hyperplane. Now, the problem is you can't distinguish the strong and the weak modal force, what ought and is forbidden and what is merely permitted and permitted not to do, if you just model those mental states in terms of choices. This is reflected in the fact that to the extent that the negation of the claim that you shall do something expresses a plan and is not just a description, to the extent that that negation expresses a plan, there's no difference between it's not the case that I shall have beef and I shall not have beef. So that's to say, the lack of a distinction between the strong and the weak modal force in the intentional operators, the fact that the external and internal negation makes no difference, and the absence of a choice distinction fine-grained enough to distinguish what you're doing in those plans are all reflections of the same basic point. And in the case of deontic cognition, where we have a distinction between the strong and the weak modal force, where there's a difference between it's not the case that I ought to do something and I ought not do something, you need to individuate the choices on those plans at a more fine-grained level of detail. This is where the notion of preference or indifference comes in. I do it in terms of a notion of single-mindedness. You get a more compact account of what's going on here if you do it in terms of single-mindedness, and if you understand that as an attitude that's specified in terms of a practical capacity for rejection. So you choose to do something single-mindedly just in case you reject everything incompatible with it. To choose indifferently is to reject rejecting something. So here's the way to understand difference specified in terms of single-mindedness and rejection. I choose indifferently to do something just in case there is some choice incompatible with that choice, but both of which are compatible with all of my single-minded choices, such that I could have made that other choice without changing any of my single-minded choices. So if I think I ought to be at the dinner tonight, and then I'm permitted to have beef and I'm permitted to have fish, I'm planning to reject everything incompatible with going to dinner, like sleeping in or having a drink at the bar at that time. But I'm choosing indifferently between those two meals in the sense that while they are each compatible with the single-minded plan to get dinner, they're incompatible with each other. So I choose indifferently between them. Now, it turns out that you can add quantification to this. You can get the distinction between de re and de dicto modality. The rejection of a rejection of a rejection gets you back to the rejection, so you get double negation, introduction, and elimination as is needed. You can unite this to a possible world semantics, and you can distinguish descriptive and intentional and deontic cognition as modeling the two moments in which our neural activity is related to the world, one in its representational, the other in its practical guises. Then you take the judgment that you ought to A and C as the set of deontic hyperplans, where a deontic hyperplan is not just specifying choices for every agent at every point of choice, but also specifying whether those choices are made single-mindedly or indifferently. But it's the same thing. The claim that you ought to do something is just a set of plans. In this case, it's the set of plans in which you choose single-mindedly to do something. And then the claim that you're permitted to do something is the set of deontic hyperplans where you either single-mindedly choose to do it or you indifferently choose whether or not to do it. And you include all of those plans so that you get the right kind of relations with negation and so that you get the entailment that the fact that you ought to do something entails that you're permitted to do it. Trust me, the semantics works. I'm happy to go into it. It's there in the book. The appendices go into it in some detail. Okay, so here's now is the phenomenological side. So I think of rejection as a practical capacity in which we bind ourselves to a course of action by not allowing ourselves to do something different. So if I think I ought to attend the dinner, I may well be inclined to do something different because something else comes along. Maybe a friend of mine invites me out for a beer afterwards, and I'd like to do that. But insofar as I've committed myself to a particular plan, I have to stick to that plan without changing my mind. I have to stick to that plan, and I do that by not allowing myself to do something incompatible with what I've settled on doing. So in this sense, rejection acts as a kind of practical form of self-government. And the capacity to reason with negation can be understood as a capacity for rejection directed at a subclass of our acts, namely our speech acts. And there's good evidence that in cognition across the animal species, greater capacities for self-control and executive functioning are correlated with greater capacities for more sophisticated kinds of cognition. All right. So the idea is that a capacity for deontic cognition over what one or anyone ought to do is a more cognitively sophisticated kind of shared practical cognition operative in shared intentionality. So the claim is not that deontic cognition is a species of shared intentionality. That can't be right because of the way negation interacts. It's rather that there are like species of a genus of practical cognition that are differentiated in terms of whether or not you have to make a more fine-grained notion of choice with deontic cognition. And we already have good reason to think that more sophisticated kinds of higher-order executive functioning are hallmarks of more sophisticated kinds of cognition, and that human norm psychology develops out of a capacity for shared intentionality beginning at the start of age 3. So here is the closing paragraph from Marco Schmidt and Hannes Ricosi's review article, Developing an Understanding of Normativity from 2018. One picture that's worth being explored more systematically in future research is that while humans and other species, notably primates, share basic forms of individual intentionality and the corresponding natural norms of correctness and success, uniquely human forms of norm psychology and uniquely human forms of shared intentionality develop in close tandem in early ontogeny, the former building on and growing out of the latter. Well, that's exactly what you'd expect given the constraints that are imposed on the model to make the difference between the strong and the weak modal operators. If you understand these as expressions of practical cognition, then this feature that is imposed on the model in virtue of the way negation interacts with the deontic modalities, but not the shared intentional, you've got to have a more sophisticated kind of choice capacity in the deontic over the shared intentional. So this is a case where I want to say, as a good Hegelian, the science of logic and the science of nature and the science of spirit are transpositions of one another across categorical divide. Okay, so here's the thought. When I'm making a deontic judgment about other people, I'm oftentimes exercising a kind of self-directed or a kind of initially self-directed self-government that I project onto other people as if I'm undergoing things from their perspective, either as agent or patient. So here's Thomas Nagel in Moral Law. Guilt and indignation, shame and contempt, pride and admiration are internal and external sides of the same moral attitudes. I want to say that's right. When I feel admiration at you handling a difficult conversation with tact, that's the pride I would feel had it been me that I'm running offline from your perspective. And if I see you strike an acquaintance, I might feel indignation. And that indignation might be understood as a projection of the guilt I would feel toward myself in such a situation, or the anger I would feel if you had struck me. So I'm projecting myself into the standpoint of the agent and the patient. And these judgments that I make of you are expressions of self-directed judgments that I am, in virtue of that projection, running from your perspective and tagging you with. Okay, and so when we observe another do or say something we disagree with, it's as if, from the standpoint of the neural mechanisms involved, we're at odds with ourselves. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about the well-foundedness of a view. I think of philosophical hypotheses as points of orientation for research, whether in philosophy or in other fields as well. And then it's difficult to know what would justification for a philosophical hypothesis be. I think one justification, one reason to think you're on track is convergence, when you get a number of different perspectives that converge. I think that's good evidence for something like a view in philosophy being well-founded. So let me talk a little bit about convergence then, and I want to mention a few things here. So Jim O'Shea's discussion of Sellars' Kantian naturalism, I think there's a way of spelling out not just Kantian naturalism, but a kind of German idealist naturalism. I think of this as a project that the American pragmatists inherited from the German idealists. So Peirce coins the view pragmatism in virtue of the way Kant uses pragmatisch in the Second Critique. And Dewey says that Hegel left a deep and permanent influence on his thinking. James is a little trickier, but James writes The Will to Believe after this crisis while he was studying in the psychological laboratories in Germany, and he reads these French Hegelians and comes out of that crisis in virtue of the view he comes to in The Will to Believe. So I think there's a way of making sense of what Jim O'Shea calls Sellars' Kantian naturalism here. And then I want to look in some detail at Kirk's views on representations of shared intentionality, because I'm giving an account of expressions of shared intentionality. So it's the My account is the view, as it were, from the motor or volitional side of the reflex arc, and Kirk is interested in giving truth conditions, conditions in which representations of claims that represent the existence of shared intentions are true. So I want to talk a little bit about that. And then I want to talk a little bit about Steffi's metalinguistic interpretation of Sellars' account of morality, because I think her view and mine are actually compatible. And then I'm going to say a little bit about Jeremy and Matthew Chrisman. Okay, so this is, I'm pleased that Kirk went through this yesterday, because this is a lot of symbolism, but we should at least be somewhat familiar with it. And what I want to do is, in 2 stages, take this really complicated claim and represent it first. So this is just the notation now, separating with the parentheses what you've got, the claim being made. And then here's an interpretation. Here's a gloss on that. So what this says is that a member X of a group we, so a claim that this member of an X has is part of a shared intention to do something, that for that to be the case, there is an intention whose content is such that for some event and some plan, X does something F that brings about that event according to that plan, and for everybody else in the group, they have plans as well, such that they do something possibly distinct from what the one individual does that also brings about E according to that plan. And then E is an event that is a becoming of the fact that we A in accordance with that shared plan. Now, I appreciated Kirk's books when I was working on my own, because he gives far and away the most sophisticated analysis of representations of claims of shared intentions. And he goes through a bunch of different kinds of cases. And it's ontologically parsimonious. So there's no need for a supermind here. You've got just individual agents making individual actions according to separate plans. And what is interesting for me is that it falls out of my analysis that an individual who is in a mental state that is modeled by the planning content that I gave will be a partial truth maker for that component. That's just what it is for someone to have a plan to do something in accordance with what everyone in the group is intending to do. So now, whether there actually is the case that that person does something, whether the event comes off, that's not a part of my analysis, but just this section here, that's the sort of thing that is an individual who is in a mental state modeled by the plan that I give for the expression of shared intention will, in virtue of satisfying that condition, be a partial truth maker for Kirk's analysis for the existence of a shared intention. Okay, so here's Steffi's view about the late Sellars, at least. She thinks that Sellars comes to a view about shared intentionality that is not an expression of a shared intention, but rather is about implication relations between shared intentions. So the view is that one morally ought to A and C just in case we shall A and C is implied by we shall promote the general welfare. And for me, this was like a light bulb moment, because I've been working with proof-theoretic semantics and thinking about proof-theoretic semantics. It's a characteristic feature of proof theory that the introduction rules, the premises that figure in the application of an introduction rule, can be appealed to as explanations for the truth of the claim in the conclusion. So the introduction rule for conjunction is if you've got A and you've got B, you can infer A and B. So if you ask a person, why is it the case that A and B? You can appeal to the premises of that introduction rule as a justification for that claim. Well, because A and because B. And I realized with Steffi's analysis here, you could give that as an introduction rule for the deontic modal operator. We shall promote the general welfare, ... that is to say there's a derivation of we shall A and C from the claim we shall promote the general welfare, and then you can use that as an introduction rule for the claim that we ought to do something. Now, what's interesting about that, then, is that if you take this insight about the role of introduction rules in giving explanations for the truth of the claims in the conclusion, you can use that to reverse engineer what a person means by the claim that you ought to do something. Because if you'd ask the late Sellars, why is it the case that we ought to A and C? On Steffi's view, he would say, well, because we shall A and C is implied by we shall promote the general welfare. But that generalizes. You can ask the consequentialist, why is it the case that we ought to A and C? And he could say, because A and C is maximizing happiness. You can ask the deontologist, why is it the case that we ought to A and C? Well, because that's what it is to respect the people involved. So that doesn't tell us what introduction rule to use, but it does allow us to have a framework within which we can talk about which introduction rule we should accept and why. And so I think that the distinction between model theoretic, plan conditional, world-oriented but practical intentionality, and proof theoretic, interlinguistic, reason-backed notions of meaning are compatible. They're compatible in exactly the way that we make a distinction between reference and sense, or denotation and connotation. Now, everybody downstream from Carnap's Meaning and Necessity thinks that intensions are functions from worlds to extensions, because Carnap in that book says, look, Frege's got this distinction between sense and reference. Reference we can do extensionally. Sense, Frege thinks that they're these third-realm Platonic objects. I have no idea what that is. Okay, thank you. I have no idea what that is. But here's what I'm going to mean by an intention. He takes this Leibnizian term, intention. An intention is a function from a state description to an extension. Well, a state description is just a possible world. He doesn't have the accessibility relation, so that's something that Kripke gives, and then Kripke's brilliant insight as a teenager was to see that once you've got accessibility as a relation between worlds, then you can answer C.I. Lewis's questions about which modal axioms hold. Well, is something being possible? Is it necessarily possible? Well, look at the accessibility relation. So that's Kripke. But the idea of possible worlds is there in Carnap already. And today, the term intention is, in many philosophers' idiolects, coextensional with function from world to extension. The old notion of intention as an interlinguistic or interconceptual notion of meaning is by and large slipped by the wayside. As a result, we have all these weird issues in metaphysics in particular about the need for so-called hyper-intentional notions of meaning. So some people talk about a hyper-intentional evolution. Well, that's just an artifact of Carnap's terminological decision in Meaning and Necessity. The idea that we need a hyper-intentional metaphysics, just an artifact of Carnap's terminological decision. And what's characteristic of proof theory is that you have hyper-intentional notions of meaning without anything like metaphysical grounding or any of these weird things. If you take the meaning of a formula to be the set of derivations that end with an introduction rule for the major operator of that formula, then the meaning of A and the meaning of A and A are going to differ. Because the meaning of A and A is the set of derivations that end with an application of conjunction introduction with A and A as the premises. The meaning of A is the set of derivations that end with whatever the application, whatever introduction rule is the application for A. So I think that, as a matter of fact, proof theory and model theory have reconstructed the old connotation, denotation. I use John Stuart Mill's terminology here. So this is a distinction that goes, some people think Aristotle does it in terms of depth and breadth. It goes at least back to medieval supposition theory. It's in the Port Royal logic, and then philosophers are making this distinction for centuries. I think that, as a matter of fact, what proof theory and model theory has done is they've reconstructed the old connotation, denotation distinction. And so instead of seeing inferentialism or representationalism as in conflict, so I'm with Bill in this regard, there's a serviceable notion of representation that's compatible with a broadly inferentialist or Sellarsian semantics. The key is, on the side of representation, we have to distinguish, on the side of model theory, we have to distinguish representational intentionality with practical intentionality. When you do that, now you've got a notion of meaning that's fit for modeling the reflex arc and the transcendental ideas of the beautiful, the true, and the good. So I think of this as a part of a project to make sense of how we could have a single process that has in evolution, natural evolution, the development of more complex capacities to sense, think, and act, and has on the side of history the development of more complex ideas of the beautiful, the true, and the good. We don't have those categories, but that's one of the things I'm trying to do. And some of you I know have heard me give the spiel before, but I'm trying to rope people on board with this. I think of this as a 2,500 year project to make sense of the beautiful, the true, and the good as a developmental process that's continuous with our capacities to sense, think, and act. And so this semantics is one way of trying to contribute to that project. Okay, I could maybe say something about how this addressed the Macbeth worry, but I think I'm farther along than I'd like to be here. Here's the coda about Jeremy, Matthew, and then the Bills as well. I wish I could say more about this. Unfortunately, to do it, I would have to get more into the details of their view than I have space for here, especially in the case of Jeremy. I've just learned so much about your book on Sellars that I think if I was to try to engage with that in any real detail, it wouldn't be adequate. So I'm just going to set aside those considerations. All right, so let me talk a little bit now about the range and depth of well-founded deontic picturing. So I think of deontic picturing as a kind of shared practical picturing, this ability to put ourselves into the practical standpoints of other people, run our motor representational neural activity from the standpoint of others, that also involves an exercise of the reactive attitudes. And I think of this as something that is present in the world. It's a thing that we can investigate. It's a part of space and time, but it also has a phenomenological component. Now, the range of the view is a question of what kind of thing it's right to deontically picture. And one answer is they've got to have structures like ours. Maybe they've got to have neural activity in the way we do. Another question is the depth. What kinds of deontic picturing do we correctly engage in? Can I deontically picture the spider as being hungry? What about as missing its mother? I mean, it couldn't even possibly miss its mother, right? So one way of addressing the hard problem of consciousness, I think Chalmers goes in for something like this, as being a panpsychist. Say that the range is maximal, it's just that in some cases the depth is so thin it doesn't really matter. That's one way of going. I'm not sure that's my way. But I do want to consider this issue of an original image and what sense we can make of it. So the question then is, what would it be for the original image to be well-founded? Okay, so James writes The Will to Believe. He thinks that there are he writes it as a result of this crisis he has while he's a young man, a student. And he thinks that there are certain decisions that are live, forced, and momentous. He later says he thinks the essay would have been better called The Right to Believe as opposed to Will to Believe. The idea is that, look, there are just certain decisions that we're faced with that we have to make a decision one way or the other. If you ask me out for dinner, I can't say I refuse to make that decision. It's a forced decision. It's live in the sense that you've made that offer, and it's at least potentially momentous. Maybe this is the beginning of a great work relationship or a friendship. So I think friendships and business offers are like this. And I think the way of reading James' The Will to Believe is that that's what religious faith is like. It's this opportunity to potentially build up a relationship. And it may be the case that you don't build up that relationship. Maybe you offer to get dinner with me, I go, and we just don't hit it off. That happens sometimes. But that's, I think, the significance of James' The Will to Believe, is that he's giving us a reason to think that religious belief is not like, I think, the will to believe, the right to believe. What are the conditions under which it's right to believe? Well, you got to give it a shot, and it might work and it might not, and it might be different for different people. It might be the case that you can't make that friendship. That doesn't mean there isn't a friendship to be made. Okay, and then I look for examples. So I was in Pittsburgh. I had my backyard. There was a garden. I had a garden, and I would sit out in the garden and read and watch it grow. And there was a cardinal that was flittering about in between all our backyards. And so I was whistling at this cardinal, and it was whistling back at me. So we were having this nice little whistle thing. And then it landed on a fence post and brushed its beak and then flew up to the gutter in the house immediately behind it and stood there. And there was something on the fence post. So I walked over, and I picked it up, and it was a little berry that had been split open. And as soon as I brought it to my face, that bird flew on down the alleyway, or the back of all of our houses, and I never saw it again that day. So I have no idea what was going on in that bird's mind, but from my standpoint, it thought I was some hapless little thing that was hungry, and so it leaves me this little bit of berry to give me something to eat. So you'll remember the thing I said about my brother's dog before. This is even crazier. It's going to get worse, Bernard. It's going to get worse. Well, no, the octopi are not part of this. No. Maybe they should be. And really, I should emphasize, I am not sure about this. I mean, this is really, I'm at the formal, the empirical stuff, I'm confident with that. I've been working on that for years. But this is my attempt to sort of just really work through some things that I'm not confident about. Okay. But there is something like a neural mechanism in the cardinal, right? There's a little bird brain there that's doing something. Well, now consider the neural activity taking place in this room as a form of thought that's knowing itself in terms of that very kind of activity. So if I'm right, there's a structure here that, and if you followed me, there's a structure here that we understand in those terms. Now, this is a physiological structure or process that develops over space and time. And to know that this structure exists is to become a truth maker for its own existence as a case of that sort of knowing. To know, to be in the mental state of knowing that that structure exists is to be a truth maker that it does exist, as a case of knowing. And so there's a phenomenological component to that activity as well. It's the kind of thing Hegel talks about as a we that is I and an I that is we. Now suppose Hegel's notion of spirit as something that's gradually come to know itself over the course of human history through such endeavors like art, religion, and philosophical and scientific inquiry. Suppose that that notion of spirit is also, as I'm suggesting, the kind of extended neural activity we've been thinking about together over the last few minutes. If that's right, it follows then that if you've understood what I've been trying to communicate, then with this very utterance, I hereby create an instance of spirit knowing itself in these terms, maybe for the first time. Now, I first had a thought like this at Steffi's thing, but I didn't vocalize it. And it occurred, and I've resisted doing it in the other two times I've given this talk because I wanted to do it here. So if I'm right, that's the existence of something that deserves to be called Hegel's notion of spirit, or a successor concept to Hegel's notion of spirit, and it exists both phenomenologically and physiologically. It's a structure in space and time that's subject to investigation. Okay, so I think of that as a form of absolute knowing. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, the chapter is absolute knowing, Wissen. It's an activity. So it's an absolute knowing in the sense that it's an activity of knowing that in the act itself, it constitutes the truth maker for its own claims of its existence. Okay, it has a phenomenological and physiological inquiry. I've covered this. Let me just get, so this is where I want to end, which is where I start, which is where I'm not sure what to think. So, you know, there I am looking at Avalanche Lake. I'm thinking about the glacier on the other side. And I don't know, like, how extensive is the moral community? There's a special kind of praise that we are owed when we recognize that the moral community is not just us or our tribe. It's all human beings, all rational beings. Well, what about animals? Are they part of the moral community? What about ecosystems? I don't know. I mean, I'm inclined to think there's something like a well-founded notion of deontic picturing that's there when I'm looking at Avalanche Lake, but I'm also in the grips of the view, and I may just be corrupted by the fact that I'm in the grips of the view. But the aspiration here is to gaze on the face of the real and to see a look of recognition in its eyes. Not just to see it as an observer, but to see it recognize you. And so the image I had, or the notion I had given to me this summer when I was talking about this, was that it looks back, and that it looks back. I'll stop there.
Thank you. So if you have questions, put your hand up, and I'll get you. Claudia, we go ahead and start with you. I'm so sorry.
That's okay.
Forgive me.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. I like the phenomena you want to capture, and I think I agree with a lot of the thesis about the phenomenology and something that I will describe more in second personal terms, I think, which is not incompatible with what you were saying. But I do have some worries, and I guess I will just put to you three worries. So you're talking about the affective side and the physiological side. So I'm assuming that somewhere there is the psychological side. And I was wondering how we understand, cognitively speaking, the kind of thing that you're saying. So it doesn't seem to me that we can model what the content of the mental states of the agent is in terms of this hyper-intentional model. So that would be a model of something which is not, doesn't contain that representation, I would believe, but I don't know, you didn't specify this. Now, so how do we match that model to the cognitive capacities of the agent? And then the other two things is, when you use Butterfield and this idea of having the collective representation, they have a very individualistic idea of that, right? You put yourself in the shoes of the other. So now it looks to me like a very individualistic picture where everybody has to be putting themselves in their shoes of others, where these different acts of doing that might be completely disjoint. You might be, putting yourself in my place, I putting yourself in your place, but those might not be the same, right? But more so, when we go from there to Hegel, and now it looks like the way we are doing this is by means of putting ourselves in the shoes of, then that looks that we need to be doing something that is massive, right? Because we need to be kind of incarnated in one, the spirit, rather than the spirit being kind of shared with others in history, and, right? Because it becomes a matter of the physiology of my. And maybe finally, I would say that some of these ideas of how to understand the reactions in those kinds of examples and the motor representations and what originally was called mirror neurons, whatever, where that is appropriate. Some people, precisely, including myself, have challenged this idea of simulation and thought about it more in terms of interaction or intersubjectivity, which indeed involves not people putting or animals putting themselves in the shoes of others, but something more of the kind of a collective action where there is more than one agent doing things together.
Okay, so I'm not sure I get the third one, but let me try to address the first two. So first, the model is a model, and it doesn't mean to capture what's actually going on in the wetware of the brain. But it's useful as a model, and I think it's basically on a par with possible world semantics for modeling human belief states. So we don't always believe all the entailments of what we believe, even though if you're just modeling a belief state in terms of possible worlds, you're going to get all those statements to come out. So a story's got to be told about the way in which we sublunary, fallible beings fail to, entertain a rejection of everything incompatible with our actions. Maybe Kant was like that, but with the exception of Kant, no person on the sublunary sphere has ever done that. I've got a story to tell about that. So I think I'm okay there. That is something I've tried to spell out in a couple of places. With regard to Butterfield versus Hegel, yeah, I mean, I'm giving a rational reconstruction of the reading of Hegel, for sure. I'm trying to make sense of what Hegel might have been in his best effort talking about. I can tell you want to say something.
Right. No, but the problem is this. If you like, if we talk in terms of realizability of some kind, it looks like everything happened at the level of the physiology of the individual, in the way you were describing. So my problem is not with Hegel at all, but with the idea that in the reason why the account of the cognitive element is important is because you make the reference to the physiology of the individual and the motor representation. So now it looks like that individual brain has to contain somehow. It has to be the base upon which this is realized. But my impression is that this is more an interconnected, that the physiology of this is not just the motor representations, is that in an environment and other people's and, maybe
yeah,
people.
So I wouldn't say that
so it would be.
Sorry.
Right. But, I mean, just because the emphasis on the physiology and the idea of putting yourself in the place of another, where that is that basically the brain, there's a reason for why they say it like that. It's because that's for them the basis of the cognitive state of representing a collective action. And so that, it seems to me, a very a commitment that you should relinquish. Let's put it like that.
I don't see why. I don't see why.
Because
I mean, the claim is not that neural activity exhausts everything that would be considering under the banner of spirit. It's just, here's something that plausibly allows us to talk about the existence of spirit as a case of self-knowing that is the kind of thing that you might think is referred to when Hegel talks about a we that is I and an I that is we. So I don't want to deny that. We're embodied in society and history.
No, the criticism is that might require you to involve other subjects as well, rather than talk just the individual.
Well, but the claim was that it was all of us in here together doing that. The claim was not that me, when I made that utterance, I hereby declare, or I hereby make it the case, that is me doing that and that you did that. It was that us collectively, we were in a shared mental state that was knowing ourselves, both in terms of Hegel's notion of spirit and this physiological process.
Right.
So I definitely have individuals.
The challenge is, what is that collective?
Well, it's
The
us in the
account
room.
that Butterfield gives is an adequate account of what it is for a collective to have that state. That's what, in any case, what I'm challenging. But that's,
Yeah, I don't.
stop there.
Sorry, I don't catch it. I mean, the collective is us in the room. It's all of us that shared that mental state in that moment. And I could be wrong about who was there. I mean, someone may have been dozing off or just thinking I was totally wrong and rejecting it. But I hope it wasn't at least me, or sorry, only me. I hope it wasn't only me. And then who's the collective? Well, it's all the people that, as a matter of fact, are in that mental state.
Glenda, thank you, and sorry about that. Thank you. So we'll go to Kirk next, but I also am worried I missed hands, so if you wanted to be on the queue, please raise your hand again. Okay. All right, thank you.
Yeah, I guess I wanted to just ask you to go over and the argument. Well, so you asked the question, what would it be for the original image to be well-founded? And it was is that right?
Yeah.
And there was a material at the end was sort of, working that out. And James came into the picture, and then, so could you say a little bit about, just rehearse that argument, because I don't think I put it all together.
The thought is, here's a way you'd think well-foundedness gets on the scene here. The thing you're deontically picturing has a structure of something like a neural structure. And so maybe the cardinal is like that. Maybe the cardinal is a thing that shares a structure of neural activity such that when it and I are engaged in whatever the thing we were doing together, I'm characterizing the thing we were doing together as, that's what makes the case that my thought that it and I were sharing a mental state is well-founded, namely the existence of this shared neural activity. Right. But I want to leave open the possibility that when I'm standing at Glacier Lake, that my deontic picturing that sense of loss is well-founded. And then the thought is, James' will to believe gives us the resources for that. Because if you read the will to believe as the right to believe, where we've got these opportunities that are like friendships or business engagements, you shouldn't expect those things to always be realized. And then it's just a matter of like, does my life go better when I endeavor to offer a friendship to this person? And then I just have to try it out. Like, maybe this is a way of relating to the world around me or another person in a way that enriches my life. I don't want it to be merely instrumental, but I do think that the Jamesian view gives us the resources for thinking about what well-foundedness would be there without requiring there being neural structures.
I see. Okay, so it's a sort of stance toward the world which is legitimate, doesn't require the world to, as it were, respond in the way that the stance, as it were, calls for. In
the case of like what we're doing or what I'm doing with a bird, yeah, that's the thought.
Bernard?
I'm fully on board with the idea of us being together in virtue of us self-knowing, being plurally self-aware of our being together. That is us. So that's the plural intentional subject. I'm not on board with the nature looking back. And here is how I see the situation. So, mind you, the word empathy was introduced into the English language 1905, according to Oxford English Dictionary, to translate German Einfühlung. Einfühlung originated in the 1850s in the aesthetics of nature. These were polytheists. They thought they knew about the cosmos and that the cosmos was divine, and that they themselves were divine, and that the relation between them was sort of a dialogue of God with himself.
Yeah, I think I'm on board.
I don't think we should buy into any of this stuff. I think there is a lot of reason in empathy becoming a psychological term rather than a cosmological commitment. Now, the central thing, and I disagree with a lot of stuff with which you work towards the right conception ultimately, but you should, in my view, you shoot over the goal by making the step from self-identification to self-predication. That's the old thing that the Hegelians do. They are aware of the special status of self-awareness, but instead of saying, well, that just gives me self-identification. It gives us self-identification, but it doesn't tell us anything about what we are. So no predicate. We might still be totally mistaken about what we are. What it gives is just that we are. And what cured me from making the mistake, by the way, is existentialism. That really cleaned off this garbage from, this old, basically Descartesian garbage from the self-identification to, well, everything I know is right. It just doesn't work.
Can I try to respond to that?
So you cannot pull the cosmos out of the head of self-consciousness. So let's stick to self-consciousness. Might be mistaken.
I think
and in this way, the nature doesn't look back. And
I think I see where I think I see what you're saying. And I guess to me, it's not clear to me at all that there's a notion of myself, certainly as a collective, that is, as it were, thin enough that I don't already have some sense of the content of what it is. And then once I realize that I've got that, now I'm just curious of what that content is. I want to start looking at it. I want to start trying to figure out what it is. And yeah, I guess I'm drawn to that romantic view of art and nature. And I mean, this is where I'm at the end of my rope in the work, because I know it's not grounded in something like even the bird. I mean, some people think I'm crazy about the bird. I know it's not grounded in anything like the bird, at least as far as I know, it's not grounded in anything like the bird. And yet it strikes me that there's something rich and worth thinking about there. And I understand that some people find that crazy and you should jettison it, but that's where I'm reaching for my William James, and I'm saying, yeah, you may not be able to be a friend with Jeremy. Maybe Jeremy and I hit it off, and maybe you didn't. That doesn't mean he's not a good friend of mine. And it would be terribly perverse if in the course of that dinner I'm just like passively waiting to see whether Jeremy is a good friend or whether we can have. It involves false starts and efforts, and I've got to go out on a limb, and maybe it doesn't work. And maybe you're the kind of person for whom it doesn't work, but that doesn't give me any reason to think that I shouldn't give it a go.
Ronald.
Different direction, technical question, going back to the early stages, right? So you make this distinction between single-minded choice and choosing indifferently, and you define that in terms of rejection. So single-mindedly choosing is rejecting all other alternatives.
Compatible with it, yeah.
And choosing indifferently is rejecting certain choices, but leaving all the single-minded choices in place. That's right? Yeah. And then you said in that context very quickly, I mean, you claimed that distinction is the same or gives immediately rise to the possibility to distinguish between external, internal negation if you treat ought and may expressively, right? So I suppose ought expresses single-minded choices, permission expresses indifferent choices, right. And it's because those two things are defined in terms of rejection, you basically solve the Frege-Geach problem, right? Yeah, so could you say a little bit about how that works?
You just treat negation as a Boolean operator, and it takes the complement of the set of states that model the thing you're negating. So what's the negation of one ought to A and C? It's not the case that one ought to A and C. That's to say you're permitted to not A and C. Well, this is the set of plans where you choose single-mindedly to H and C. So the plans that are not, the hyperplanes that are not part of that set are the hyperplanes where either you choose single-mindedly not to A and C, or you choose indifferently whether or not to A and C. And that's just the complement.
Okay.
So it's just the Boolean logic that philosophers have been familiar with since Boole, and it's just the set theoretic model theory that philosophers have been familiar with since
Tarski. And that's external negation then?
Well, that's right. That gives you external negation.
Which is the one we worry about.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bill.
Okay. Just a quick suggestion. At the beginning, you sort of said, okay, we've got the in Sellars the sort of original image before. Who's the philosopher of that? And my suggestion is going to be that's Heraclitus. So Heraclitus says, everything is full of souls and divine spirits.
Okay.
So we don't know much about what he might have meant by that. But okay. So more technical thing about this sort of metalinguistic account of ought.
Yeah.
So a worry you might have about that is sort of, it seems to make sort of it seems to make something of a mystery about, say, moral disagreement between, say, consequentialists and Kantians, right? Okay. So, if they're just disagreeing about what introduction rules we ought to have, then it looks, it looks as though, then you could just say, well, look, Kantians, aggregative consequentialists, they just mean different things by ought. And look, you can have as many different introduction rules for different constants as you like. It's only once you start sort of having the elimination rules that you need to start worrying that there might be sort of potential conflicts here. So suppose I'm a Kantian and I think I'm having an argument with a consequentialist. On your account, it looks as though we're just talking past one another. We're just sort of talking about two different subject matters.
No, because we both use the term ought, and then the question is how should we understand what we mean by that term? And we're also disagreeing over what to do. So I think one of the virtues of this account is that in virtue of having denotation and connotation as complementary, we can talk about the fact that we might agree about what to do but disagree about why. So I might say, you ought to split those cookies up so that everyone in the room gets some. And I agree. And we have different reasons for that. You do it from a consequentialist standpoint. I do it from a deontological standpoint. And then we might get to a point where we disagree. So the cookie monster comes in, right? This thing that gets maximal. He always gets more utility from one more cookie than anybody ever gets from a cookie. And so it seems like on a simple reading of consequentialism, the cookie monster should always get more cookies. And now we can disagree about whether or not we should share a plan with regard to the cookie monster. And then we can ask ourselves, why do we disagree? And you say, well, it's because I think that we have to maximize utility, and he gets more utility out of the cookies. And I think, no, we got to respect people. And so now we're having a disagreement about what to do that is grounded in the fact that we're both trying to determine what to do. We just have different reasons for why we think we ought to do what we think we ought to do.
But hang on. I mean, if the meaning of ought is, it can, we're disagreeing about what the introduction rule for ought is. Of course, we're using the same word, right? Okay. But why isn't it on your account that actually this apparent disagreement between us turns on an equivocation, right? Okay. Why isn't it the case that, I can say to you, well, look, sure, you can have this sort of, deontic modality, utilitarianly ought, and I'll have this modality sort of Kantianly ought, and now the apparent disagreement between us seems to vanish. But actually, we've been arguing as though there's some kind of substantive disagreement.
Here's why we disagree, because expressions have both denotations and connotations, and we have to figure out what to do. In the case of deontic claims, they involve cognition, but in the same way that we could disagree about, triangle. I might think triangle should be understood in terms of interior angles. You think it means in terms of sides. So we can disagree about the connotation, but we're still talking about the same things out there. Namely, so we can sort the extension, the denotation, so that we agree. It's just we differ in the connotation or the sense. So that's a characteristic feature of disagreement about language, right? We can, and in morality, it comes up in terms of the distinction between doing the right thing and doing it for the right reason. So we might agree about the right thing to do, but disagree about the reason for it. And that doesn't mean we're equivocating. That just means we disagree about the sense. We agree about the extension. And there may be other cases where we disagree about the extension as well, the denotation. So you might think that you should give I have the plan to give the Cookie Monster the cookie when he comes in, and I have a different plan.
I hope this isn't a violation of a norm, but I wanted to ask the last question, despite my status as moderator.
It's what I would do if I was you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm really intrigued by the glacier looking back, and I wanted to ask you whether you thought that its capacity to look back, or treating it as if it could look back, is necessary for it to be morally considerable, and if so, why?
I guess my inclination is to say it's not that the glacier looks back at me, it's that the cosmos looks back at me, the real looks back at me. It's the whole experience. Like when I'm in the presence of that thing, and in that regard, it would be like if I see you in pain owing to the fact that your arm is broken. My recognition of your pain is not from your arm. It's from how that arm fits in with you. And so I'm inclined to think that that's, or at least it seems to me, it feels to me, the phenomenology to me seems to be something like that. What looks back is not the glacier, it's the cosmos, of which the glacier's being what it is what elicited that look.
Right. I mean, so maybe so then a suggestion, something would be helpful to make that really clear. Aldo Leopold, right? Classic example of an ecocentrist. Most people read a Sand County Almanac. There's also Think Like a Mountain.
Okay.
Right. So
I don't know that.
it'd be worth comparing, because
Yeah.
Ultimately it's a statement. To think like a mountain is to take on the to recognize the importance of the interdependence of all the parts of an ecosystem and their interrelations, and but then to explain how your view is different from that Leopold type ecocentrism.
Yeah,
I think could be helpful just for the comparison.
Thanks, I
and you could say to look back like a glacier.
Yeah. Thanks. Do we have time? Because Glenda, I know, still had more she wanted to go back and forth
We
with.
have
Or unless somebody else.
we have time for a buzzer beater. Yeah, please. Sorry, I didn't see you, Heath.
In classical terms, you're looking at the universe as a whole having a single mind. You're a Stovall.
I've been called worse. Yeah.
All right, thanks everyone. Let's thank Preston, please.
Thank you.